Hey there, game developers. Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines 2 was delayed indefinitely last week after the publisher fired the developer. Gaming commentators are coming up with wild theories about who is to blame. I've seen people blame the publisher, I've seen people celebrate the firing of the development team, and I've even seen some weirdos blame individual developers for being too woke, whatever that is supposed to mean. So instead of engaging in wild speculation, let's talk about the business and production side of game development to find out why games get delayed, canceled, or get released as a buggy mess. If you hear someone blaming Paradox or Hardsuit Labs for this choice or accusing any of the developers of being incompetent, then please show them this video. It can be really easy to point to one reason that the game keeps getting delayed, but game development is a lot more complex than most people realize. I also want to recommend Outstar's video on this subject. She is the only other commentator that I've seen that knows what they're talking about. Before we get into the current events, let's talk a little bit about the history of this project. The first Bloodlines game was developed by Troika Games and was released in 2004. Troika Games was co-founded by Tim Kaine, Leonard Boyarsky, and Jason Anderson. All three co-founders had worked together on the original Fallout games at Interplay, so all three had experience developing CRPGs. The studio released 3 games. The first was Arcanum, which was a buggy, steampunk-themed CRPG with a UI and gameplay that felt kind of similar to the Fallout games. The second was The Temple of Elemental Evil, which was a buggy yet very faithful video game adaptation of Dungeons & Dragons. The studio's final game was Bloodlines, which was a buggy video game adaptation of the tabletop RPG Vampire the Masquerade. You might have noticed a couple of themes with the studio's games. All 3 were role-playing games, and all 3 released with serious bugs. We'll circle back to that genre bit later in this video, but right now I want to talk about why some games get canceled and other games with serious bugs get released, because it's not incompetence and it's not laziness. Game studios are businesses. Games are a very expensive product to develop because they require a team of developers to work on them, and they can take several years to develop and release. Studios can also come up with a reasonable estimate of how much money their game will make when they sell it based off of data from their past releases and the releases of other studios. If the cost to develop the game is estimated to exceed the amount of money that the game is estimated to make, then it means that that game is likely to lose the studio money. Now, if the team realizes this early in development, their best option is to cancel it before they spend more money on it. But when the game is near completion, it makes the most sense for the business to spend as little money as possible to get the game to a releasable state to minimize their losses and try to earn back some of the money that they already spent on development. This means releasing a buggy game, and this choice damages the studio's brand, and it has a future cost of lower sales on all future titles by that studio and increased difficulty getting their next project greenlit. Troika's best-selling title at the time of their closure was their first game, and their worst-selling title at the time of their closure was Bloodlines, their last game. The developers at Troika were some of the best CRPG developers in the game industry. The reason for their studio's eventual closure was financial. They had to release those games when they released them in order to keep the studio running and keep paying their developers. Each game performed worse financially, despite all 3 being really great games. When you're pitching to a publisher, they're looking to answer 2 very important questions. Is this game worth funding? And is this the right team to develop this game? If the answer to either of these questions is no, then you probably won't be greenlit and your game won't be funded. While Bloodlines was Troika's worst-selling game at the time of their closure, it has since become their best-selling game over time because it has generated a cult following. The game industry is described as a hit-driven industry because most studios try to develop hit games. Hits make most of their sales at launch, but make fewer sales in the future. A cult classic might not be a hit game, but it will continue selling well into the future. Cult classics can look like a commercial failure at release. Cult classics can provide long-term stability and long-term success for a studio. This answers that first question. This game is worth funding. There's a really good GDC talk by an indie developer who kept his studio running for well over a decade without releasing a single hit game. Link in the cards and in the video description. I also want to point out that you might recognize these charts if you're a YouTuber. That hit game line is what you'll see in your views on a video that is focused on a trending topic. That's the pattern you'll see in the views on this video, because I'm talking about a current event. Not many people want to watch this video 5 years from now. The cult classic line is closer to the pattern you'll see in what is referred to as evergreen content, like a video that teaches you how to play a guitar. If it's a good tutorial, then people will be coming back to watch it for years. And this is where we are circling back to why all of Troika's games were CRPGs. Your team is judged based on its institutional knowledge. Institutional knowledge is the combination of experience and expertise possessed by your team. If a team that has experience in first-person shooters pitches a first-person shooter, then the publisher can reasonably judge whether or not that team will successfully develop the game that they pitched. If that same team of developers pitches a role-playing game or a horror game, the risk is higher that the team will struggle or will develop something different from what they pitched. This is likely what happened with Hardsuit Labs. The original Bloodlines was not known for having great combat. The combat was actually kinda janky. Bloodlines was known for its narrative and its quests. Hardsuit Labs has a ton of credits for first-person shooters. They were also able to recruit Brian Mitsoda, who was a narrative designer on the original Bloodlines, but they did not have a narrative team until they started working on this project. They weren't necessarily the right team to develop a role-playing game, but Paradox greenlit their pitch. And I want to be very clear here, Paradox is very selective about which pitches they accept. In a given year, they might receive over 400 pitches and greenlight between 1 and 3 games. Hardsuit Labs had to have a very compelling pitch to get greenlit, and Paradox must have been aware of the risks that I just talked about. And this brings us to the first delay. The first delay happened in October of 2019. The CEO of Hardsuit Labs and the narrative lead, Brian Mitsoda, made a joint statement that they did not want to repeat the mistakes of the original Bloodlines. In an interview with Shack News, the narrative lead and a senior narrative designer revealed that most of the story was complete and that most of the dialogue was already recorded. Recording the voice acting happens very late in the narrative process because it's expensive to make any changes to the story once the dialogue has been recorded. If you make a change to lines of dialogue that have already been recorded, then you have to schedule time with voice actors to come back in to record, and the voice actors get paid a bonus for every session you have to bring them back in for. So these changes get very expensive very quickly. Locking down the narrative also means that there can't be drastic changes to the story or the levels of the game. It looked like the game was very nearly releasable at this stage and that all that remained was some polish, but looks can be deceiving. And this takes us to the second delay, which happened in July of 2020. Brian Mitsoda and the studio's creative director were both unexpectedly fired. And this is where we begin to see the problems that were happening inside the studio. Brian described the firing as a surprise and said that he had never been led to believe that he had not been successful. In management, there is a principle of no surprises. If you are a manager and you have a member of your team that is not meeting expectations, then you schedule a meeting with them. And in this meeting, you explain those expectations to them. You describe the gap between where they are now and where they need to be. And this is the most important part of this meeting. You must, at some point in this meeting, say something to the effect of, or you will be fired, or you will lose your job. The team member that you're meeting with needs to leave this meeting knowing exactly what they need to do to keep their job, and they need to know that they will lose their job if they don't. You can't hint at it. You can't use ambiguous language. If you end up having to fire them after this meeting, they will already see it coming and they will know exactly why it happened. Brian was honest in his shock at being fired, and the leadership of Hardsuit Labs most likely knows what they're doing when it comes to management and providing feedback. However, if you recall from earlier, Hardsuit Labs did not have experience managing a narrative team prior to the creation of this team. This means the team would likely not be aware of the risks added to the project by recording voice acting sooner rather than later. This is a lesson that many studios end up learning the hard way. Putting tasks off until later always feels like a bad idea that will delay your game, but it's not always the case. Given what we know, it is likely that Brian crafted an excellent narrative, but the narrative team got ahead of the rest of the development team. Other aspects of the game may have necessitated changes to the narrative, but those changes would have been costly because most of the dialogue had already been recorded, and that may have also required sacrificing the quality of the narrative for the quality of other parts of the game. What's best for the narrative isn't necessarily what's best for the game. But it would be reasonable for Brian to push back against changes that he believes would have required re-recording dialogue or would have required drastic rewrites. I probably would have pushed back on those requests if I were in that position. However, this kind of pushback could be very easily misinterpreted as stubbornness or an unwillingness to work with other disciplines or other departments. And this perceived unwillingness to work with other disciplines can very easily appear to be the reason the development of a game is slowing down. And this is most likely what led to the firings. And this brings us back to the importance of institutional knowledge. The two developers that had been fired had been with the project since the beginning, and they've been at the studio for several years. Over those years, they have built up knowledge about how the game was being developed and why certain narrative and design decisions were being made. When these two developers were fired, that institutional knowledge was permanently lost. No new hire at Hardsuit Labs can bring that knowledge with them. Hardsuit Labs brought in a consultant to take over the creative director's job. A consultant being brought in is not unusual, but it does suggest some specific problems in the production of this game. The consultant they brought in offers services focused on marketing strategy, creative vision, and production. While Hardsuit Labs would have needed him to fill in as creative director, the service he offers that they probably needed the most was production. The game had to have a strong and clear vision to be greenlit by Paradox, and the marketing strategy should have already been figured out well before now as well. I mentioned earlier that you wouldn't want to record voice acting until the end of the narrative design process because it makes changes to the dialogue expensive. The narrative design of the game does not exist in a bubble. The different parts of the game are all interconnected. One small change to one part of the game may necessitate several changes within other areas of the game. If you build your levels before your traversal mechanics are in, the team may either have to rework the design of several levels to work with your new traversal mechanic, or change the traversal mechanic to work with all of those already existing levels. One of these changes is expensive and results in a much better gameplay experience, but the other is cheaper, but it results in a worse gameplay experience. If your artists get too far ahead of the rest of the team, they may end up creating a ton of production quality art that never makes it into the final build. If you record your dialogue too soon, then the level designers are constrained to build the levels to fit the story, or the narrative team may have to rewrite and re-record dialogue, which I mentioned becomes very expensive. This is actually a problem that the Star Wars The Old Republic team ran into with the tutorial quests. But they had a convenient in-universe workaround. Anytime you spoke to an NPC that had their dialogue changed after recording was turned into an alien that spoke an alien language that was subtitled. Game development is cross-disciplinary, and it requires putting what's good for your game over what's good for your discipline or your department. This might mean delaying the voice recording to make it easier to make changes to the game narrative in order to provide more flexibility to the level designers, or delaying level design to work with systems designers on the game's traversal mechanics. Knowing which tasks to prioritize and which to delay is typically learned the hard way through experience. It's part of that institutional knowledge that a studio builds up over time. Hardsuit Labs didn't have that experience when it came to how the game's narrative ties into the other parts of their game. So it's not surprising that the narrative would have gotten ahead of the rest of the development in a way that could cause problems. This is also why a publisher considers a studio's institutional knowledge when deciding whether or not to greenlight their pitch. If Hardsuit Labs had come into this project with a proven history of developing games with a strong narrative, then I would probably be playing Bloodlines 2 right now instead of filming this video. And this brings us to now. Paradox fired Hardsuit Labs as the developer of Bloodlines 2. Now, this was probably due to an ongoing pattern of missed milestones starting from that very first delay. Pretty much every action that Hardsuit Labs took in order to accelerate the development of the game had the unintended consequence of creating further delays on the project. Losing leads and senior team members during development is a guarantee for delays. Team stability is very important to successful game development. Teams that experience one or more reorganizations during development, or have a lot of developers leave or join the project mid-development, are more likely to experience delays. This probably sounds counterintuitive, but adding new developers to a late software project causes that project to be delayed even later. This is known as Brooks' Law. And this is where we get to why Hardsuit Labs was fired as developer of Bloodlines 2. When a studio and a publisher agree to work together to release a game, they will agree to a contract called a publishing agreement. This contract will specify things like who owns the intellectual property, how much money the publisher will pay the developer in advance, and what the revenue share between the publisher and developer will be. This contract will also specify what happens when things go wrong. Most publisher agreements will establish a process to follow if the developer can't deliver the Gold Master by the agreed upon deadline. Typically, the developer will need to notify the publisher well in advance that they can't make their deadline, and the publisher can choose whether or not to extend that studio's deadline. And when Paradox made the decision to fire Hardsuit Labs, it came down to those two questions they had to answer when the game was pitched to them originally. Is this game worth funding? And is this the right team to develop this game? Paradox asked themselves these questions and concluded that yes, the game is still worth funding, but unfortunately concluded that Hardsuit Labs was no longer the right team to develop the game. There is no one person or company that is to blame for the delays or the firings. Everyone at Hardsuit Labs and everyone at Paradox did their best to make sure that this game would be the best it could be for the players. Many of the actions intended to accelerate development unintentionally slowed it down. When Paradox called this decision difficult, they were serious. Paradox has extended the deadline at least 2 times, which is twice as many extensions than what most publishers will give their development teams. Managing game development is hard work, and actions your team takes to accelerate development early in the project can surprisingly turn into delays down the road. I have the benefit of hindsight in this analysis, which is something that the producers on the team did not have during development. The problems that led to the current situation were unfortunately unnoticed until it was too late to change the outcome. If you're interested in hearing more game industry news analyzed by a game developer, or are interested in learning more about game development or the game industry, then please subscribe to my channel. I try to do daily videos about game industry news, and I have some educational and tutorial content in development right now. This video took a bit longer than a day to research, film, and edit. I hope you all have a wonderful weekend, and I hope to see you back here next week.